Hi everybody, your microeconomics exam is coming up in a few days' time and you need application to get those A's and A stars. The examiner will expect it from you guys. No matter what the question is, they will want application. And if you don't have extract data there to help you, what are you going to do? Well, this video is going to give you absolutely everything that you need. For every topic area in the course, I'm going to provide you application. A huge amount of work and effort has gone into making this video because I know how difficult it is to do it on your own. So make sure you take everything down and you memorize all of this stuff to use in your essays. Now bear in mind, I'm not going to go into huge detail with these examples because otherwise the video will be too long. So you can go and research if you want more depth to use in your essays. But this is very, very, very powerful stuff. Write everything down from start to end. Let's start by looking at markets and all the stuff around markets. When it comes to the basic economic problem, you're looking at scarcity. Water scarcity in India and China, big issues. You've also got food scarcity issues around the world. Great to use in your essays. Demand shift right. Let's look at all these curves. Demand, supply and shifting both ways. For demand shifting right, UK housing, low interest rates you can talk about. Higher price of a substitute like rent, for example. Higher incomes in the UK. Coffee and makeup, these markets in India, big increases in demand, changing trends and fashions. Fast food in France, inferior good. Incomes have been falling in France, pushing up the demand for an inferior good like fast food. A demand shift left, landline phones in the UK, frozen pizzas, newspapers. These are all changing trends, you could say, movement towards other items instead, like mobile phones, like fresh pizzas, like online news. Public transport in China, an inferior good. As incomes are rising in China, more cars are being bought, less demand for public transport. For supply shifting right, oil, fracking, new technology shifting supply to the right. Bumper harvests of goods like oranges, like wheat, like corn, good weather bumper harvests have reduced the prices of these items as supply shifted to the right. Indian subsidies, great to use examples not necessarily UK based, will show good wider knowledge here. India subsidises fuel, subsidises rice, subsidises gas to bring down the price to improve the affordability for its citizens there. What about a supply shift to the left? Gas and electricity. Have you noticed that prices have been rising over the last 6 months? You can blame very poor weather across Europe had made distribution of gas and electricity difficult as the pipes have frozen up, increasing costs there. China manufacturing, higher labour costs in China now, as increasing costs of production for China manufacturing. Europe freeze, as we saw in November, December, January. Bad weather, increasing prices of staple items like lettuce, like courgettes, for example, carrots, that kind of stuff. What about elasticity? Well, when it comes to inelastic demand, great to have examples of this. Cigarettes, alcohol, fuel, fast food, sugary drinks, rail travel should be easy to apply to the determinants of PED. PS, electricity and gas, you can argue low spare capacity there, large production lag. Commodities, same kind of idea, low stocks of certain commodities as well. Housing in the UK, cereals, so good examples for you to use there. What about for XED? If we look at complements, great to use examples of complements where you've got the same business or the same supplier that is producing both complements, like, for example, coffee machines and capsules, Nespresso, printers and printer ink, Epson, for example, games consoles and games, razors and blades, Gillette, So you've got good examples, even razors and the shaving cream that comes with it. Good examples for you to use. So then if the price of the first complement falls, you'd expect demand for the other to rise. So then maybe if they're very strong complements, drop the price of the first, raise the price of the second to increase profits, right, for a business. So good to use complements where you've got the same supplier producing both. Substitutes, fast food burgers, classic trainers, Nike, Adidas, phones, Samsung versus Apple. Easy to give good examples of substitutes there. For YED, think your normal goods, right? Just go back to XED, complement, negative. Sign, XED, substitutes will be a positive sign. YED, normal goods, will be a positive sign. As income goes up, demand goes up. Think cars, especially luxury cars, designer clothing, restaurant dining, foreign holidays are all good examples here. What about for inferior goods? They'll have a negative sign when you do a YED calculation. Fast food, staycations, are holidaying at home, right? Public transport, own brand food, cheap clothes. Write these all down, absolutely fine. Let's now look at other aspects of markets, right? We want to look at indirect taxes, subsidies, minimum prices, maximum prices. General application of indirect taxes, you've got fuel duty, cigarette duty, alcohol duty, sugar tax and carbon tax. These are all specific indirect taxes. It's a tax per unit sold. Whereas VAT is an ad valorem tax, stands at 20%, i.e. it's a percentage tax based on the final price of the product there. The higher the price, the more the raw value of the tax is going to be. What about subsidy? Let's look at UK examples of subsidies. Subsidies on solar panels, on electric cars, in-work training programs, R&D, museums, public transport, all have got subsidies. If you go around the world, you've got agriculture in the US. So many agricultural products are heavily subsidized in the US for protectionist purposes, to protect US farmers. You've also got fuel, gas, rice subsidies in India to improve the affordability of these basic items for Indian citizens. You've got vaccinations in Hong Kong, a merit good, to encourage more production and consumption of vaccinations in Hong Kong, where you've got a heavily privatized healthcare system there. Minimum prices, we can go around the world here. Let's look at the EU. The EU Common Agricultural Policy is a big minimum price scheme for goods like butter, milk, wheat, to protect farmers there, to provide a stable income for farmers. Alcohol in Scotland, so this is a minimum price that has been accepted and is planned to be implemented this year to discourage the consumption of a demerit good like alcohol there. In the Ivory Coast, there are minimum prices on cocoa and on cashews, again to protect farmers, to provide a stable income there. And you've also got a minimum wage in the labour market. Another name for minimum prices are price floors. The price can't go below it, hence it's the floor price. Whereas a maximum price is known as a price ceiling. The price can't go above it. Let's look at real life examples there. Let's go around the world. Maximum prices on staple food items in Venezuela, again to protect consumers from high prices, although as theory suggests you get massive excess demand for these items in Venezuela, huge shortages, big black markets. So a great example for you to go in and to research there. Rent control that exists in New York, Berlin and Paris, so maximum prices on rent there. Good to research those examples. But also proposed rent control in the UK. That's a Labour Party policy. If they win the election coming up, they're going to implement rent control and maximum price on rent. And also energy caps by the Conservative Party. They pledged that they will do that if they win the election. Ed Miliband in 2015 proposed it. The Conservative Party have pledged that they'll do it if they win the election. So excellent there. Let's now look at market failure application. For market failure causes, negative externality in production. Chemical and metal manufacturing, driving cars. Think of driving cars as a production activity. The driver is a producer of a car journey. Deforestation, desertification, resource depletion, resource degradation, write all these down. But crucially, guys, whenever you cite an example of an externality, let's stick with this example, a negative externality in production, you've got to make sure you do three things. The examiner will be looking for this. Who is the separate agent? What are they doing? So in this case, what is the production activity taking place? Then you've got to say who's the third party and how are they suffering in this case. Those three things you always need to do. Cite the separate agent. Who's the third party? How they're suffering or benefiting if it's a positive externality. Very important, those three things are done. So write these examples down, but crucially, you've got to say what is the externality that comes as a result of this activity. Alright? Negative externality in consumption, i.e. demerit goods, cigarettes, alcohol, fast food, sugary drinks. Red meat, sunbeds, there are others as well. If you've got your own examples always, write those down too. Positive externality in consumption, i.e. merit goods, vaccinations, education, healthcare, sun cream, public transport, school lunches. Again, make sure you can write down the actual externalities that come with that, doing the three things that I mentioned before. The separate agent, the third party, and in this case, the third party benefit. Positive externality in production. Not many students will have examples of this. In-work trading and R&D. The third party here will be other firms who can poach workers, who can copy or steal technology without having to bear the costs, the very high costs of in-work trading and R&D themselves. Public goods, non-rival, non-exudable. So you can say flood defences, roads, beaches, street lights, road signs, bridges. Apply all of these examples to the characteristics. If we look at quasi-public goods, you can consider roads, you can consider beaches, bridges, to be a good example maybe of public goods that are quasi as opposed to being pure all the time. Common access resources, well, resources we get from seas, from the forests, and also air. Right, these are your classic common access resources. Think of sea and seafood, the resources we get from the sea. Think of forests, pulp to make paper. Think of timber for logging, etc., and for wood. In terms of resources we get from the forest, okay? Overexploited, common access resources there. What about policies to solve? Well, if we look at indirect tax and market failure, sugar tax, fuel tax, alcohol tax, carbon tax, cigarette taxes are all examples of indirect taxes to reduce consumption of something. Subsidy and market failure to encourage production, to encourage consumption. Solar panels, electric cars. Vaccinations in Hong Kong are heavily subsidized for children. Research and development, in-work trading to encourage more production, positive externalities in production there. Regulation and market failure, there are tons, absolutely tons here, if we generalize. Bans, so for example, smoking bans in public, bans on advertising, for example. In France, they banned the refills of sugary drinks, so fizzy drinks. Do you know how sometimes you can buy drinks for like, I don't know, £3 and you get free refills? That activity is completely banned in France. So good examples to use there. Things like age limits on alcohol, on cigarettes, they're good examples there. Time restrictions, so in countries like Scotland, in European countries, there are time restrictions on when alcohol can be served. So often not after 11 p.m. alcohol can't be served. Graphic images on cigarette packets, warnings on cigarette packets like smoking kills, quotas and caps, so pollution caps for example. In Singapore they've got quotas over how many cars can be on the road at any one time. They're great to talk about as a regulation. Anything that's compulsory, so compulsory vaccination, they're talking about that in Italy right now. They're talking about that in the US, compulsory recycling, like we see in the UK. There are loads of examples of regulations that you can apply to different types of market failure, so think of your own examples there as well. State provision, to encourage more consumption, more production. Schools in the UK, state schools, the NHS, various public goods like roads, like beaches, like bridges, like flood defences in the UK. Tradable pollution permits, the Kyoto Protocol, which is a global solution to try and reduce pollution in the world. And not all countries have signed it, but that's where it started, the Kyoto Protocol. And then you've got the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme. That's a European policy to try and reduce market failure when it comes to pollution, tradable pollution permit scheme throughout the European Union. Minimum price and market failure, you've just got the one, alcohol in Scotland. The minimum price on alcohol has been accepted, it's gone through Parliament. Plans are for it to be implemented this year. Maximum price and market failure, rent control in cities like Berlin, in New York and Paris, proposed by the Labour Party if they win the election coming up. Energy caps proposed by the Conservative Party, but also proposed by Ed Miliband in the election before. So good to know that. Income inequality is a market failure that's looking to be solved there. Excellent to know examples of causes and policies of market failure. Let's move on to market structures. Big application now. Market structures is a big deal. It's going to come up in your exam. You need good application. Let's look at perfect competition. You should know there is no real-life example of perfect competition, no perfect example of perfect competition, but there are some markets which come very close. Market stalls and tuk-tuks, very close. The only characteristic that doesn't fit, there is a slight barrier to entry, which is a permit, a license. You know, that takes it away from being perfect competition, but very close. Foreign exchange, or the buying and selling of currencies, is another good example. Very close to perfect competition. Keep in mind, very competitive markets. Close to perfect competition, but not quite there. So if ever you want to compare to a very competitive market, you've got these three, but you've also got these ones to talk about as well. These are hyper-competitive markets. Fast food, cars, short-haul airlines, supermarkets, even though these two are by theory oligopolies in the UK, they are hyper-competitive. Price wars happening in both, that's why. If you've got your own examples, of course, use those too. But good to have knowledge of very competitive markets or markets that are close to perfect competition. Monopolistic competition, what examples do you have here? Taxis in the UK, clothing, restaurants. By restaurants, I don't mean like the fine dining ones, I mean like your chain restaurants, like Nando's, for example. Hairdressers, salons, hotels, streaming of music, streaming of TV, monopolistic competition for you to use. Whenever you're justifying whether something is monopolistic competition or whatever, you need to apply it to the characteristics. That's how you can justify the market structure. What about oligopoly? You know that oligopoly can have both competitive outcomes and non-competitive outcomes. So good to have knowledge of both. So competitive oligopoly, UK supermarkets, price war, short-haul airlines, price war, the global soft drinks, you've got Pepsi and Coke, the two dominant players there, non-price competition there. Long-haul airlines, non-price competition there. Oligopoly and non-competitive outcomes, so you might want to argue collusive outcomes for some of these. UK Energy and the Big Six, tacit collusion, price leadership there. Great one for you to use. UK fuel providers, again, price leadership, so tacit collusion, especially when it comes to supermarkets. I'm not talking about Esso, BP, Shell, I'm not really talking about those guys so much. I'm talking more about the supermarket fuel providers. Tesco, Morrisons, Sainsbury's, Co-op, these kind of guys that are in there, Asda. UK bus market, I wouldn't say collusion there, but you've got local monopoly power, so very non-competitive outcomes of this oligopolistic market in local areas. Monopoly power, again, important for you to know there are no pure examples of monopoly, but there are some pretty good examples of monopoly power. This is what you need to focus on. So you've got Google Search, you've got Tesco. Tesco got market share of around 28-29%, remember? What defines monopoly power is at least 25% control of a market by one firm. Tesco, I've got 28-29% market share. Google Search got 88 to 89% market share. And there is exploitation. Go and research that if you want more detail. The London Underground is a natural monopoly. Gazprom, that's a Russian energy company dominating Eastern Europe, the distribution of gas and electricity in Eastern Europe. Merlin Attractions in the UK. They control Alton Towers, Thorpe Park, Legoland, Chessington, Madame Tussauds, London Dungeon and other attractions too. Big monopoly power in the UK when it comes to tourist attractions and leisure activities. Stagecoach, the bus company with local monopoly power in areas like Cambridge. Good to research that and how they hike up fares in those areas. Durex, the condom company, right, from personal experience, yeah? Durex, 80% market share in the UK, 26% global market share. The wife isn't pleased with that one. So that's a nice one to use. It's not controversial, it's a very good example actually. Both global monopoly and massive UK monopoly with 80% market share. Contestable markets, you've got taxis, you've got hotels, fast food, book selling, parcel delivery. You can argue this because there was a threat which has actually become real in all these markets here. Uber coming in there, Airbnb there, and you've got Five Guys, burgers and fries coming in there. So that's how you can argue, right? Privatisation of Royal Mail has meant parcel delivery is very contestable market. Diminishing returns, if ever you're talking about that in an essay, you can talk about factories and manufacturing, farming. Flooding your fields with more workers eventually will lead to diminishing marginal returns. Economies of scale, always good to have general industries where there are big economies of scale. Think supermarkets with purchasing, with technical, with managerial, with marketing. Airlines with purchasing, financial economies there. Online retail, purchasing economies. Tech firms, technical economies, big there. Pharmaceutical, technical economies are massive there. Energy companies have got huge economies of scale. Good to have knowledge of barriers to entry as well. So barriers to entry, economies of scale is one major barrier to entry. You can use all of these examples to back that up as well. Think of areas where there are big patents, so pharmaceutical companies, your electronic companies, so having knowledge of markets where there are big barriers to entry as well. Supermarkets is another good example of that. Airlines when it comes to bulk buying and economies of scale there too. Profit max, Apple, pharmaceuticals, electrical companies there. Why do they profit max? Because reinvestment is a big, big deal. If you can reinvest and innovate, you can patent whatever you're innovating. And that will give you even more monopoly power going forward, even higher supernormal profit going forward. So the important to make profit, to then reinvest, to keep your profits higher, and maybe to develop big monopoly power. So these are three excellent examples there. But you should also know that there are other objectives that other firms might go by. So great for evaluation, for a long essay that might come, discussing whether profit max is the suitable objective for all firms. On the one hand, maybe. On the other hand, there might be other objectives, like sales max. Costa in the UK going for a sales max, growth maximisation objective here, to flood the market with stores, develop brand loyalty, and then to raise prices later in profit max. Amazon, Netflix, Spotify, the whole point is to develop brand loyalty, to build a huge customer base, a database of consumers that use those services to then change objectives later to look to make profit. CSR's corporate social responsibilities, good to have examples of that. Disney, the way they treat their workers in theory, although if you actually dig down, maybe not so much, but that's what they cite. Starbucks, how they make sure that where they get their coffee beans from, the farmers are paid a good wage, to make sure that the beans are made organically. Microsoft and the charitable activities that Microsoft get engaged in, aid money to developing countries too. Body Shop and how they often advertise the fact that their products are tested not on animals. Yeah. Monopoly regulation, important, this always comes up somewhere in the exam. Good to have knowledge, right? Different types of price regulation. RPI price regulation, train companies in the UK. RPI minus X, airports, and the landing charges. So an airport like Heathrow has got RPI minus X regulation. Go and research it, you'll find good articles about that. RPI plus K, the water industry. Performance targets, GPs, how many patients they must see in a given period of time. Ambulance drivers, getting to emergency calls in a certain amount of time. Gas and electricity companies, how they can't cut provision to the elderly, for example, in the winter. Train companies and how many delays they're allowed to have on a given day. All performance targets. Merger policies, these are very recent examples of mergers that have been investigated, blocked, or some kind of policy to alter the merger. Betting shops, Coral and Ladbrokes, the merger there. The ferry crossing, how it was Eurostar that was banned from operating ferry crossing services. Pharmaceuticals, you've got the merger between Celesio and Sainsbury's group there. Just Eat and Hungry House, this merger was announced just a few days ago, heavily investigated by the CMA in the UK. Privatisations, you've got recent ones such as Royal Mail, and you've also got rail. This one tends to come up a lot, discussing the impact of these privatisations. Deregulations, discussing the impact of bus deregulation, and airline deregulation. Airline deregulation across the European Union, very successful. Bus deregulation, not so successful in the 1970s at all. Local oligopoly, local monopoly outcomes, the result there. Let's keep going, guys, by looking at labour markets. Labour markets, let's look at the demand for labour and look at professions where demand for labour has shifted left first. Pilots, air traffic controllers, bank clerks, retail workers. The reason why? Applied to the shifters of labour demand. So we look at pilots and air traffic controllers. Less demand for holidays as the weak pound is bitten, right? For bank clerks and retail workers, capital, and the fact that the price of capital has come down and is replacing workers, demand for labour therefore shifted left. Look at app and software developers though. That's a profession where demand for labour has shifted right quite considerably. As the demand for the final product has gone up, the price of the final product is high quite significantly, boosting the MRP. That explains why demand for labour has shifted right there. What about wage elasticity of demand? So let's look at professions where the demand for labour is very wage inelastic. Premier League footballers and cleaners. Remember your determinants here. We can argue the substitutability between labour and capital is very low. You can argue in both professions, absolutely. You can argue the elasticity of demand for the final product is quite low as well. Good to look at those examples there. What about, we've got wage elastic demand for labour. What professions there? Well, one example, good one, is call centre workers. Very substitutable, these guys, for capital. At the same time, you can argue that the cost of call centre workers as a percent of total cost is quite high, making demand for labour here quite wage elastic. Supply of labour. If we look at professions where the supply of labour has shifted left, you've got hotel receptionists and vets. You can argue two big reasons here. Higher barriers to entry. When it comes to hotel receptionists, speaking lots of languages, for example here, vets, the qualifications to become a vet has become a lot tighter. You can also argue that non-monetary benefits of the job have been taken away. So if a hotel receptionist is expected to work difficult times, night shifts, same for a vet. Supply of labour to the right. You've got nurses, holiday reps. You can argue the barriers to entry has come down for both quite significantly, less qualifications required. Also big non-monetary benefits for holiday reps. Wage elasticity of supply is quite inelastic for these professions, teachers, nurses, chefs, doctors, engineers, lawyers, pilots. You can argue a few things. Vocational elements to these three. Absolutely, doctors, engineers, lawyers, pilots, the nature of skills required, extremely high skills required, which means that even though wages go up, the supply doesn't necessarily increase proportionally as much, because it's very hard to get the skills. Length of the training time as well is very high for these professions. The opposite for these professions, hence why the elasticity of labour supply is quite wage elastic for these professions. Travel agents, for waitresses, for hairdressers, cleaners, driving instructors. Nature of skills very low. Length of training period quite low. Monopsony Employers, good to have examples. The NHS, so if you look at nurses, doctors, right? Dentists, monopsony employer is the state for all those professions. State schools, teachers, yeah? Majority of teachers are employed in the state sector. So the state is a monopsonist employer. Walmart is a huge global company, global brand, employs so many employees there, monopsony employer. McDonald's, again, the number of employees that work for McDonald's is huge. You can argue monopsony employer, especially in some countries. Minimum wage, know that it's currently £7.50 per hour for those who are 25 years old or more. Living wage, this is not law, this one is law. The minimum wage is law, the living wage isn't law yet, although both parties, Conservatives and the Labour Party, want to push to make the minimum wage equal to the living wage. The living wage stands at £8.45 per hour outside of London, £9.75 per hour in London. The Gini coefficient in the UK stands at 0.34, good to know that, and also good to have knowledge of UK policies to redistribute income. If we look ahead, it's good to know what both parties are pledging, what they want to do. So taxing the rich, we all know that that is a policy to redistribute income. Well, we know the Labour Party are planning to do that, aren't they? Those who earn more than £80,000 a year, they want to increase taxes there. They want to tax corporations more as well, get that up back to 26%, corporation tax. Transfer payments, Labour want to reverse the welfare cuts that the Conservative Party pledged. Government spending on education and health, both parties are going to commit to spending more on education and health. Minimum wage, we've just said that both parties are planning to raise the minimum wage, try and get it to equalise the living wage. So good to have knowledge of policies to redistribute income there. So that's it, guys. That covers labour markets, and that's the whole video finished as well. You've got all the application you need for every single topic area in microeconomics. Make sure all of this is down, memorize it. If you want to research some of these in more detail, go ahead. It should be very easy to do so now. Go out there and smash it, impress the examiners with amazing application. I know you'll do it. I'll see you all later on.